Well, it is a pleasure to be with these two fine gentlemen. We have, I think, quite a treat in store for you. As you see, we have a deliberately different format in terms of how we're sitting. This is meant to invite the idea of a fireside chat. We have a new format in the summer seminars. Those of you who've come in the past know that we do keynotes and panel discussions, but we thought that that a conversation is yet a further step beyond a panel discussion, in particular because we want to bring these two fine gentlemen into conversation with each other. And I will be trying to make that happen through, I may not need to make it happen given what I know about the two of you, but I will try to...
Which means we can talk a lot.
Try to, yes, so steer you all and pose questions that I think will be fruitful to hear the answers to. And of course, we will also take this to all of you in the audience. So be thinking about your questions. We will use the same format as before with the microphone, and please stand up and as always, be as succinct as you can. So I don't think much needs to be said by way of introduction because we have our beautiful personalist biographies that you perhaps have read, but just a brief word of introduction. So Greg Bottaro is the founder of the Catholic Psych Institute, and I don't know whether you want to talk a little bit about your biography, which is relevant to how this came about, and I'll be asking you about that.
Sure.
But he has a fascinating story that involved a period of time in the CFRs and mentorship under Father Benedict Rochelle, who incidentally was a great friend, the spiritual director of Alice von Hildebrand, so a close bond we had with him. And the work that you're doing is of great interest, and a particular interest in our audience here because it is informed totally by personalism. It's really an initiative in psychology that is personalist in nature. And Jim Beauregard is a lecturer at Rivier University in New Hampshire. He is a neuropsychologist and neuroethicist who has come to personalism and personalist philosophy with an extraordinary level of energy and interest and ongoing study. Jim is an associated scholar of the Hildebrand Project and a frequent collaborator in the things that we do. So just delighted to have the two of you all
Thank you.
here. So Greg, why don't we begin with you? Why don't you tell us a little bit about this interesting journey of yours that brought you first into psychology, then the formation you had, and ultimately to the institute that you have founded?
Sure thing. Well, my origin story gives a lot of meaning and clarity to where I am now. So just to kind of go back a little bit, I was 17, 18 years old. My parents had just divorced, and I was on my way to school, and I was a freshman at Boston College. My life was turned upside down because of that divorce. And I was blessed before transferring to Franciscan to have a year with the study of Peter Kreeft. And so he introduced me to John Paul II, and I read Love and Responsibility. And I read Love and Responsibility, and it literally healed my heart in that space where I was in that pain by giving a purpose and meaning to love and marriage, and it realigned what my heart was feeling with what was true, good, and beautiful. And I read that book, and I had this yearning to share that kind of healing with others. And that was the birth of my vocation. And so I was looking constantly for the place to study Love and Responsibility as a marriage therapy workbook. And it didn't exist. And so, and I was, constantly looking for ways to integrate the faith with psychology and the pain that people go through and our suffering. And it eventually, in my own personal discernment, brought me to religious life. And so I joined the Franciscan Friars in 2004. And so for 3.5 years, I was trying that way of bringing together healing of suffering with the faith. And it was, as you said, under the mentorship of Father Benedict Rochelle, a brilliant psychologist, priest, really holy man, simple and profound appreciation for having peace by being with God in the present moment. So really tying in an abstract faith that can be over-spiritualized at times with just the experience of our day-to-day. And that's what I really fell in love with. He helped me learn how to pray more and better and deeper. And so I healed some more of my own wounds, discovered I didn't actually have a supernatural vocation to celibacy through the friars, and left to go get my doctorate I spent 5 years in D.C. at the Institute for Psychological Sciences, which is the most Catholic doctorate you could find that does, it's part of integrating these things. And then met my wife in 2012, moved to Manhattan, started a practice, and now 11 years later, we have 7 kids, and we've got 15 therapists, and we're building a whole new model for how to actually help people in a Catholic way.
Definitely not a supernatural vocation to celibacy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I found that out really quickly.
That's right. That's right. We'll come back a little bit more to the institute that you've created and the developments that it's now taken.
Sure.
But Jim, maybe we'll let you tell us a little bit about your origin story of sorts and the way in which personalism has found its way into your work as a psychologist.
This is a personalist comment that I'm making sort of in carryover from this morning. We talked about technology a lot, and I just wanted to mention one particular article that I have found very helpful in thinking about technology is an article by Mark S. Latkovich, or Latkovich, depending on how you spell Asadia, thinking about technology from a Catholic moral perspective. A critical consideration of 10 models. I'll give you the reference for it after if you like. He gives 10 different models of technology and evaluates them from a Catholic moral perspective. He pulls from Benedict, he pulls from John Paul, but also from the secular world, and asking the question, how should we as Catholics think about technology that's already there, technology that's developing. So I just wanted to mention that before I forgot to. I was a cradle Catholic. My mother was an Italian Catholic. Her parents came over, and I don't think I've ever disclosed this here yet, but my dad was Protestant, Unitarian. But they made the decision that I would be raised Catholic. He always came to church for the big events like Cub Scouts and First Communion and things like that. But on Saturday nights, I would often go down to my Protestant grandmother's house and stay over. So I grew up on Sunday mornings watching Oral Roberts and things like that. I don't think I ever told my Irish pastor, Father John Murphy, that. He would turn over in his grave now if he knew, I think. But so I said, raised Catholic. I actually entered the seminary, St. John's in Brighton, to the college and studied there for 4 years, thinking about becoming a priest. And in my case as well, the system worked. I left. It became clear that this was not for me. But I got a good, solid grounding in the philosophy of Perennis, the Catholic philosophical tradition, and that insulated me at the ultra non-Catholic university where I got my doctorate in psychology at Northeastern University. I was there for 4 or 5 years, well, 6 years if you count the master's degree. We had one discussion about religion that entire 6 years that I was there, and only because the students requested it. The faculty just don't want to deal with this stuff. This is not what we do as psychologists. But when I was in college, I was first introduced to John Paul II. He became Pope the year before I entered the seminary. So the whole world was reading The Acting Person and Love and Responsibility to say, who is this guy? So I was introduced to personalist thought before I knew that was its name, and that there was a whole tradition across the 20th century about that. And so for me, this has been a process of kind of deepening and expanding. And I came not all that long ago to Dietrich von Hildebrand and here to the Hildebrand Project, for which I am eternally grateful and have learned a great deal here. And so part of what, after my PhD, I had 2 years of postdoc training in clinical neuropsychology at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center. And so I've been working as a neuropsychologist since the mid-1990s in a geropsychiatry practice, a geriatric psychiatry. The youngest you can get in the door to see me is age 65. Don't take anybody younger. And I spend most of my time doing evaluations with folks who may have dementia. And so part of my job is to say, is this what it is? And if so, what kind is it? Is it Alzheimer's? Is it vascular dementia? Is it frontotemporal dementia? Clarifying that and then working with the individual and with their family from that time on. Oftentimes behavioral problems come up in the context of dementia. We work with families on how to manage those things, provide education, but also, I will periodically then follow up with the person I first saw to say, where are things at now? Have things gotten any worse? Are they the same? What else can we do to help? It has caused me to think a lot about end-of-life issues. And that was kind of an intro into the world of neuroethics, the ethics of neuroscience. I've published a couple of books about that. I came from a Catholic world where the person is fully conceived and understood into a world of neuroscience where you basically are your brain. But you're not even your brain, you're your brain above a certain level of functioning. And if you fall below that level of electrochemical brain functioning, then you're no longer considered a person. And it's okay to throw you away, or maybe harvest your organs first and then throw you away. The other end of life, you're not a person until you have a brain. And that doesn't come right at the beginning of pregnancy. It comes a little later on when there's recordable electrical activity. So what I've seen happen across neuroscience, and because of its influence across the wider culture, is that you have this kind of notion of human being, this beginning of life to end, but then the notion of person, which keeps getting smaller. At the beginning of life, you're not a person. At the end of life, you're not a person. If you have certain kinds of brain injuries in between, you may not be a person. So much of the work that I've done in neuroethics has been pushing back against that, to say, no, you guys got it all wrong. You're a person from the beginning to the end, and a person worthy of respect because you have intrinsic dignity, and what Hildebrand would call ontological dignity. So that has been kind of the academic work that I've done. I teach in a PsyD program, biological basis of behavior, and the ethics course, kind of the two areas that I sort of put together. So that's what I've been doing since the 1990s. Yeah. More recently, I've been thinking about personalism and psychology. I'm an eternal student. I've gotten myself into a master's program online at the University of Anahuac in Mexico City that is a master's degree in personalist philosophy, explicitly. It's infused throughout the program. The course I just finished was personalism and sexual identity. So bringing in all of the good Catholic writing about that, and having the chance to talk about all the stuff that's going on with transgenderism and you name it, and why these things might be a problem. Let's look at the history of feminism and see what's happened in it. And there are things that are good about it. There are things which really gone off the rails. But to be able to think about those things from an explicitly Catholic perspective in a Catholic culture has been just wonderful.
Yeah, well, thank you. And we'll have to pursue some of this further in our conversation. But Greg, I want to turn to you and get your thoughts on the respects in which personalism, what are the sort of the key personalist ideas that have come to inform how you think about psychology in the Institute? And certainly feel free to tell us all a little bit more about the shape the Institute has taken of late, because that too is very interesting. But let's begin maybe or either way, I'll let you decide what you want to answer first, because I want to make sure people get to hear both.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's been really wonderful to deep dive into John Paul II's thought to start, and what we found in unpacking person in act from a psychological lens is the blueprint of the human person. And I use this example, this analogy. If your car breaks down and you need to go to a mechanic, you want to find a mechanic who knows how a car is made. And a mechanic who understands what's broken and where to get the pieces to fix it. And that blueprint is essential to the healing process. And so the horrible sort of secret to psychology is that there has never been a blueprint. And we just have a study of theory after theory in clinical psychology anyway, which is just one individual's great idea to the next throughout the history from Freud till present. And then sometimes they have enough empirical data and evidence to back up their theory, kind of. And then we bring in the technological advances with brain imaging, and we get into the neuropsychology and neurobiology. So maybe it influences and enforces some of these theories. But at the end of the day, these are taking shots in the dark at what it actually is to be human. Then we unpack person in act, which is sort of unapproachable unless you're an academic classroom, and then we're finding, wait a minute, these ideas have already been made sense of. We understand the composite of body and spirit and all the layers in between, from the somatovegetative up through consciousness into the transcendence of the person, and that weird overlap in the middle of consciousness. And then we have the layers of subconscious thresholds. And all these things that psychology has been pretending to know something about for 120 years. And yet nobody has gotten close to what John Paul II has already done. And so we found the secret, and we're sort of unpacking it as quickly as we can to figure out, how do we fit this into anxiety, depression, marital distress, gender dysphoria and ideology? How do we plug this into parenting practices? All the normal work that comes into our office, we're figuring out how to use this key that unlocks the right way to actually help people. And so that's our foundation. Yeah. And then so that's where personalism really is everything that we do. Our new training program is called the Catholic Psych model of applied personalism. I mean, it's literally the name of our program. It's a CP map, and it's our way to help people know how to see people, how they're formed, how they're broken and or wounded, and how we can help through accompaniment to heal them. And so that's been the driving force behind what we've been doing. Started off just having a normal private practice and trying to bring these ideas into regular therapy. And I don't know which direction you want to go in or which direction is interesting for you, but at some point I really hit a wall of frustration thinking this secular model is not actually helping people as much as I think a Christian vocation could. If I go back to my roots of vocation, and what am I doing to serve Christ? I think I can do more than this. And then out of that, we developed new ways to actually walk with and help people. And then out of that, we've developed now ways to train others to do the same thing.
What would you say was the hallmark of the secular model that wasn't working?
The compartmentalization. And I say this now, and I'm very careful when I'm talking about this because there are a lot of people still doing this. And you're probably still doing this, and I was still doing this up until very recently. No, but what I say is there's really important and good work being done behind enemy lines. So what I'm about to describe is the structure that good Catholics and good people have inherited, and they're doing good work within. But I think there could be better structures built if we build from a Catholic anthropology. And so, very basically, that we meet for 45 minutes once a week. And, people are living their lives, and they're suffering in their lives. And then we say, well, let me check my schedule when I have time for you. And, it's next Tuesday, be in my office at 3 o'clock, or now we meet on Zoom. And so, you stop your life, you wait, put your suffering on hold, and then, come talk to me next Tuesday at 3 o'clock, and we'll have 45 minutes. And that's when you're going to get your chance to say everything that you need to say and hear all of the brilliant wisdom that I have to give you in those 45 minutes. And then we tie that up and, sorry, time's up. We'll see you next week. And just being in that, doing that for so long, I was sharing earlier, I have other coaches that I've taken on and for different things, nutrition, even for like marketing stuff. They don't teach you marketing in graduate school for psychology. You have to figure all this stuff out on your own. And so, it's like, all right, well, get a coach to help you, figure out these things. And I had a coach that was talking to me every day about a website. And meanwhile, the clients that I had that were suffering with end-of-life issues or marriage, it's like, wait till next Tuesday at 3 o'clock. And there was just something in me that felt frustrated by that I thought maybe there's a different way. So, to put it really simply, the human experience of encounter and accompaniment that Christ models for us, he enters into the life of the woman at the well. He meets her where she is, in her sin, in the consequences of her sin, and just has a conversation where she is before she was ready to schedule an appointment to figure out how she gets help. And I thought maybe there's more we could do to really enter into where people are at in their life professionally. And so that's I would say one of the hallmark things. It's a more integrated and daily approach to really accompanying people.
And let's pursue this a little bit. So the way in which this happens, people aren't coming to your office every day.
No.
Tell us about how this happens.
So this is a fascinating plot twist, especially for a personalist conference. So, and this was shocking to me. But as I've dug deeper into this, I've seen a different way to interpret it. But we use technology, and we use the word of the spoken voice, and it's recorded. So what we've done is we've been able to figure out how do we walk with people on a daily basis to be much more a personal and intimate part of their life, at the same time using technology, which creates an asynchronous dialogue. And whereas a lot of people, and rightly so, are hesitant about technology and social media, and I loved some of the comments earlier from Rachel and others about things that we need to be really on guard of. We're also, as said, not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So what does this help us with? How we become more human and have deeper relationship? And so we've been able to use the technology to create these asynchronous interactions. And that means that we can actually walk with our entire caseload every day. And so we're using recorded voice, and I don't know how far off we want to go on this, but it actually enhances the therapeutic effect and the therapeutic efficiency, which is a very different kind of relationship than, say, building a friendship or dating, which we would never say do that online or build a real relationship with technology. But this has a very specific telos. When somebody comes to us for help and we're offering our help, there's a reason for it. And now we've found this more efficient way to actually deliver a personal encounter that is more integrated and can actually be more helpful.
So in effect, people leave, they call or they send a message, a voice message, and you all are able to respond to that at another time to them, and this allows them to communicate when they're really suffering and in pain, as opposed to having to hold on to that, and then perhaps showing up when those experiences have become, it's amazing how suffering can be acute, and then the next moment it sort of fades away. So you allow them to catch that.
We're with them every moment.
Yeah.
And so they can reach out to us and leave that message at 3 o'clock in the morning or in the afternoon right before or right after a big fight, or as they're stressed and anxious and suicidal, or any of these other things that are happening in real time in their life. They're marking it and giving it to us, and we can hear their voice and really understand. Or simple things like somebody's really distracted because their kids are screaming in the background. Whereas if they had scheduled that appointment and set aside that time, it might take 3 months before we figure out that's actually a hallmark of what we could really work on. Whereas after 2 days, I can see right away how disorganized somebody is and how scattered they are because of these other kinds of real life issues. And so that's what's happening, and it's a daily thing. So it's within 24 hours we give a response back, and we build a real dialogue. And within 2 weeks, you've actually gone back and forth 10 times in 10 days, and you've found yourself in a real relationship. And it becomes very clear very quickly that this is a real relationship, and there's a deep intimacy to it. It's very personal. And because we've actually separated out a lot of distractions and really zoned in on something, not surprisingly, focused on the word. And the word actually communicates the person. And that's where we sit with people.
It's fascinating, intriguing. We'll have to probe it more. Jim, I want to maybe bring you in on this. The two questions are, one, you are a personalist psychologist, so it'll be interesting for you to perhaps comment on what you're hearing from Greg, but I'm also interested in drawing you out on the respects in which personalism, how do you see personalism distinguishing or making the kind of work that you do as a psychologist distinctive, as opposed to perhaps training you would have had beforehand? I know you're a kind of personalist by nature, and this is the unfolding of Jim Beauregard to move into personalism. But I think it'd be very interesting to hear you to speak a little bit more about what it means to be distinctively personalist in a psychological practice.
Yes. In 2013, I went to a conference for the International Conference on Persons. Take a look at that if you haven't. It's a philosophy conference that gets held every other year. But I had contacted one of the folks who was organizing the conference. His name was Jan Olaf Bengtsson, and I had asked him some questions about personalism because I've been reading about it. And his response back to me was, well, based on your questions, come and speak at our conference. So I bought a plane ticket to Sweden. The first dinner I had there was in an Italian restaurant in the city of Lund. And the keynote speaker for that conference was Juan Manuel Burgos, Spanish philosopher. He gave like an hour and a quarter talk or so. By the end of that talk, I said, okay, now I have to learn Spanish and read everything this man has written. I've been studying his work. He was in the first year of my master's program. I did a thesis under him, and I'm sort of in the second year now. So he's become both sort of mentor and friend. But much of what I've thought about psychology in personalist terms has come out of the Spanish-speaking world. And so some of the work I'm doing now is to bring some of that into the English-speaking world where it doesn't exist yet. You mentioned that kind of standard way of doing therapy, see you next Tuesday at 2 o'clock. And it reminds me of one of my own teachers would say, sometimes you sit down at the beginning of a therapy session with a client and say, okay, let's begin by talking about what you're going to bring up in the last 2 minutes of the session. Because you're holding it back, and then you can say, okay, I'm going to mention it, then I'm going to run.
The doorknob comment.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, see you next week. I'm having dropped that bomb.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I've learned from and about from Juan Manuel is his model of the human person. He's written fairly extensively about philosophical anthropology, what's the nature of the person. And I think one of the things that we've sort of seen kind of as an undercurrent here is that when it comes to all the different kinds of questions we're talking about, if you get the person right, then you get a lot of things right downstream from that. You've all got a handout at the end of your row. It's the one that's the circle like this. And this is my friend Juan Manuel's model of the person. I use it in thinking about personalist psychology because it's pretty complete. He sort of understands the person. You see sort of 9 boxes in the model. But you might not be able to see it on this diagram. There's dotted lines between all of them. He conceives of each of these different boxes as an aspect of the whole integral person. You can't pull any one of these out and separate it out from the person. So how he describes the person is we have different dimensions or levels to us. We have a corporeal dimension, our body, but not just our physical body. We heard it said a couple times this week here, a statement that I actually disagree rather vehemently with, talking about us as animals. Rational animals. It's like there's a leopard right here, and you stick rationality into its head, and you have a human being. Juan Manuel, and I agree with him on this, is the better word is corporeality, because our body, our physicality itself is personal. We're not just animal bodies. That's one of the things that Aristotle may have gotten wrong. Rational animals. What does that do? It immediately puts us in the category of animals, and it doesn't fully account for who we are. He makes a striking comment in one of his books that to touch the body, this stuff here, to touch the body is to touch the person. Now, corporeality is a dimension of who we are. It touches body, psyche, and spirit. This is the reason why things like physical and sexual abuse are so destructive. Physical wounds heal, and you never see them again. You never know they're there. But if you know anyone who's struggled with these things, you know there are other kinds of wounds that run much deeper and that take much longer to heal, and they can do a whole lot of harm on the way. But it starts with touching the body, which then becomes touching the whole person. The flip side of that is you have to take these things into account as a therapist when you're working with someone. So there's that corporeal dimension, then the psychic dimension. This is mostly what psychology talks about. Emotions, feelings, passions, imagination, memory, tendencies and desires, a kind of conscious psychic life. But then he adds in what he calls the spiritual dimension. And he actually uses that as a technical philosophical term for all that which is not obviously mechanical, measurable about us. And what does he put up there? Affectivity, knowledge, dynamism, the heart. All of what he says about affectivity is pulled from Dietrich von Hildebrand's book, The Heart. And in that book, Hildebrand starts by saying, we've made a mistake about affectivity in the history of philosophy, and that critical mistake is we've identified all of human affectivity with the passions. What are the passions? They're those really, really intense emotions that can overwhelm reason. And since we have a lot of cognitive vision in Aristotle and Aquinas and in our tradition, passions are bad. There can be some good things about them, but the fact that they can overwhelm reason, so we get the term crimes of passion. Someone just loses control of himself and kills somebody. But Hildebrand says there's also spiritual affectivity. This is where love and happiness and aesthetic feelings and appreciation of beauty, all these things are not mechanical, psychological things that we can measure. They are of the essence of who we are, but they're not sort of touchable in the same way that our body is. Our intelligence, our experience, our understanding, and our free will. Part of the reason that psychologists and neuroscientists argue there's no such thing as free will is because they're looking at the corporeal dimension and the psychic dimension. Most of the stuff that goes on there is mechanical. It's either physically mechanical, it's organic. No place for free will there. Where do you find free will? At the spiritual level of the person. When you look there, it's all there. It's obvious. If you don't look there, you can't see it. So one thing that this model has been very helpful to me with is looking at the whole person and thinking that this is who needs healing. Not just down here, not just some psychological stuff, but we need to take into account every single aspect of the person, and that any intervention I do with the person needs to, in one way or another, address all 9 of those different dimensions. As you mentioned, your kind of psychotherapy techniques, there are over 100 distinct identifiable kinds of psychotherapy. None of them talks about the spiritual dimension of the person in an organized and holistic way.
Right, they're all missing the mark.
Right.
It's really amazing.
Yeah, and so they're letting that whole sort of top row in the diagram you have there, We're not even paying attention to that. Or on the rare occasions we do, we look at it from the bottom up. And what do we try to do? We try to measure it. If any of you have followed any of this stuff on psychedelic research, we psychologists have developed scales to measure spiritual experiences during taking psychedelics. There's scales for that stuff, as if you can measure the whole thing. There's so much that goes on in therapy that is not the psychological, not the physical, but that subsumes those into a much higher reality. And kind of in terms of that second question, at the conference in Santa Barbara just a few weeks ago, somebody in the room said, I was doing the talk, somebody said, well, how would you define personalism? Okay, we have Dietrich, Hildebrand, all these other folks, and I said, personalism is basically any philosophy that begins with the human person and moves outward from there. And then Mark Spencer added, and comes back to the person in the end. And that's what really characterizes personalist thought. And think about that in contrast to the philosophy of the Middle Ages, a philosophy of being. And before that, in the ancient world, a philosophy of nature. So personalism is a way of looking at things that begins with the person, stays with the person, and looks at the universe from that perspective, coming back around to who we are again. And when you bring that kind of a vision into psychotherapy, you see all kinds of things, and you ask questions that you wouldn't ask otherwise. If I'm looking for target symptoms, thinking about which technique I'm going to use with somebody, you give me a problem, I'll help you fix it, then you can go home. The behavior therapy took the internal life out of us altogether. It said, we're all about observable behaviors. You come in with a symptom, that's the target symptom. You do some behavioral intervention. When the symptom's gone, you're cured. Go home. That's missing something.
And it discredits our entire field, which is really frustrating.
Yes.
Because most people have had experience either with themselves or a loved one or somebody that's like struggling, try to get a therapist, and it didn't help. Mm-hmm. And it takes 3, 4, 5, 7, 8 different therapists trying to find the right fit, the right person. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, it might be a good fit just because it's a good relationship that develops with the person, and it's not even the technique,
right?
Which is what the studies actually show. But it's really infuriating when it's like we actually can do a lot of good, mm-hmm. but none of those who've come before us are planting on a model that is eternal, mm-hmm. that is a full picture of the human person, mm-hmm. and so. The only real psychology is a Catholic psychology. That's mm-hmm. our proposal. Mm-hmm. And I think we have a lot of work to do to convince the rest of the world, but
yes.
They need it now, so we're ready for it.
Sometimes when I talk with this model with clients and things, I'll say, okay, another way to think about this is you were looking at the Imago Dei. You're looking at the Imago Dei, all of who we are. All of this is God's image. We tend to think of Imago Dei as things like rationality and that kind of making us distinct from the animals. But this is all Imago Dei. All of it gets hurt. All of it needs to be helped. All of it needs to be healed.
Mm. So before we go to questions from the audience, let me pose one more question to both of you, and maybe we can answer it briefly and unpack it more during the Q&A. And that is bringing this full circle to the theme of gratitude and what you all think the role of gratitude is, how you conceive of it in your practices, and is there a personalist spin to that in your conception of gratitude? So we'll maybe go to you first.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the core of our model is recognizing our existence as a gift, and the only proper response is one of gratitude. And it's not just a spiritual platitude, and it's not just a moral norm. It's a human standard, because we exist in a place. This is one of these moments of integration that makes a lot of sense. In psychology, in the secular science, we recognize that there's a fundamental awareness of death that creates the death anxiety, and that's the most primal underlying anxiety, even underneath Freud's libido and power struggles and all these other things. Underneath it all, it's the most obvious thing. In all of our biology, every cell in our body has a survival instinct. And there's all sorts of genetic theory and everything else built on the survival instinct. And yet, as soon as you become aware, you're aware of the fact that we're going to die. So this is an immeasurable contradiction internally. Every cell of my body wants to live forever and is ordered to live forever. And yet my clear awareness of reality, as I start to look around and notice and make connections that, wait a minute, every one of us dies. So how do I make sense of this reality that I'm confronting right now? And so that is the beginning of all other defense mechanisms. That is the initial compromise we make with reality as soon as we are rational. And once we have compromised the reality that we are all going to die, and we live by ignoring that reality psychologically, everything else is up for grabs. I can think of myself as the greatest person in the room. Why not? I'm ignoring the fact that I'm going to die. I can think of myself as being the worst person in the room. Why not? I can also ignore the fact that I'm going to die. So the only answer to the deepest psychological pain is an answer to death. And if we are created from the eternal divinity and in his image, and then we really follow the story of our Christian anthropology and salvation history, the only actual way for psychological flourishing and freedom is through Christ and the resurrection. It's the answer to the death anxiety. So gratitude sits at this fundamental place of awareness of reality. And we're all a little bit psychotic. We're all a little schizophrenic. We've all made compromises with reality and live in an illusory world. But if we want to come out of our fantasies and illusions, the only way out is through Christ, and it's total gift. And so in that one, it's that one action of receiving and then giving our response of gratitude in turn that actually unlocks our capacity for peace and happiness in the world.
We just push on that. It was very, very beautiful and very compelling. But do you see, from a therapeutic point of view, do you see gratitude as something that can or needs to be cultivated in some sense to sort of complete this circle of receiving the gift of our life, including our life in Christ?
Absolutely. Yeah. So going to human action and how, as you said, we as we go out into the world starts at the person, and then how our action actually comes back and forms us. That's part of completing the circle. So if we don't initiate and engage our own response of gratitude, then we are not completing the circle. And so then we are just here. But our psyche is still working. The survival instinct is built in. So that part is by default. All of the stuff we can see in the brain, all the stuff in the cells, all of those things are by default or ready to go to survive. And then awareness of reality that we are going to die is immediately causing the contradiction. So unless we step out of it by recognition of God's grace and his gift, and then complete the gift with a response of gratitude, then we're not stepping out of that place where we are. And I think it's concupiscence. We can look at that as being an effect of the fall. It's death entering into the world created the death anxiety. And I think that that's part of all of our biological place in the world right now. Love to be able to measure the biological genetics of Adam and Eve before the fall, and make comparisons psychologically, what was different in their neurology.
Time 1 and time 2, yes.
But yeah, exactly. But we'll just have to guess at this point. But I think that gratitude is that participation into the action that connects us to God's grace.
Oh, thank you for that. Jim, would you like to comment
Yes.
on that, and then we'll go to our
Yes.
audience.
One of the things that I love about psychotherapy in the Spanish-speaking world is that it's a Catholic culture, and that informs psychology, which means it's automatically enriched right from the get-go. The psychoanalyst that the Spanish-speaking world looks to as kind of their foundational figure is Viktor Frankl. Man's search for meaning, logotherapy. And I'm convinced that part of the reason they look to him is because he was one of the early practitioners of psychoanalysis who was willing to ask the big questions and who was willing to give big answers to them. Some of the psychotherapy thinking that's being done, and this is this book here, it's called The Art of Accompaniment. I pulled some stuff from it for my lecture. We'll get to it if we can, but I'm in the process of translating this book into English. I finished the second chapter, which talks about what psychotherapy is in this vision. It was too long to make it a handout. If you'd like to get a copy of it, I put a little paper out here, give you an email, I'll send it to you. This particular author, in a master's program in kind of family counseling, talks about psychotherapy as accompaniment, skilled accompaniment. So he's pulling from Francis's theology of accompaniment, bringing that into the therapy situation. And he says things that I could never say to another American psychologist and not get in trouble. The first thing he says is that psychotherapy is a gift and psychotherapy is an act of love. Right? Psychotherapy is if I said that in a psychology conference, there'd be like 20 complaints against the board of registration in New Hampshire against me, but before I was done. Loving your patients, come on. He's talking about agape, he's talking about caritas, but psychotherapy is an act of love. I had a conversation with John Crosby. John, I guess it was on one of those days where your anger management was going pretty well. And we were talking about human dignity, and the comment you had made was that if you want to know human dignity, first back up, you have to know the person, and the way you know persons is through love. So, to John Paul's comment, in love and responsibility, what is a human person? The kind of entity to whom the only appropriate response is love. Nothing less than that, love. When you love, you come to know the person. When you know the person, you come to understand their dignity, you come to have reverence for them, and as we heard this morning, I think it was Rachel who said it, when reverence is there, gratitude is going to go hand in hand with it and arise from that kind of a vision. There's little ways to get there, but it's integral to the process. If you approach a person the right way, and that person is the person approaching you, gratitude is going to rise up out of that interaction, out of that encounter.
Well, thanks to both of you. Why don't we turn to our audience now for questions? We can't see super well, so stand up and...
There's two really bright lights right up there.
Yeah.
Good thing I'm tall. Hi, I'm Dutch Knight. I want to address philosophical anthropology, and I guess while we're at it, theological. Being a big fan of JP2 and Ratzinger, especially their anthropology, I wanted to ground it in the tradition, and I happened upon Dr. Jacob Wood. I don't know. Do you know the scholar that he teaches here? Anyhow, he looks at Thomas a little differently than some other Thomists who you have. I guess you could say synthesizers. You have like people who will try to blend it all together of Thomas, from Contra Gentilis to Summa Theologica. Yep. Well, have you heard of maybe a new perspective of thinking of the that Thomas puts forward a different psychological anthropology or epistemology? You have here the relationship between self and the like, but in the prima secunda, it seems as though Thomas puts forward a different perspective that I think seems more aligned to what you're looking at, where both the intellect and the will have their own sources of light and motion, and between them, there's different acts of... Yep, sorry. It's what we do with philosophers. We're wordy. Long story short,
philosopher, I'll give you an answer just as long. But what specifically are you kind of thinking about in terms of that?
Yeah, have you tried reconciling like your psychological like anthropologies, philosophical psychological anthropologies, not only with JP2 but also Thomas, because it seems that JP2 is very much a Thomist as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to answer that. I love this conversation because I think a lot of times in the abstractions and in the philosophy we can get too polemical, and I think there's, at least the way I look at it, is to have a spirit of humility and just really giving reverence to those who have come before us, and recognizing that there's two dimensions to our world and church and the body of Christ. Is that there's the foundations and the objective truth, and then there's the continual development. We're all a work in progress. And what is true for each one of us individually is true for the world and the church. Become what you are. And so John Paul II, I don't think it's correct to just sort of put them next to each other. Are you more of a Thomist or more of a personalist? John Paul II credits Thomism as his own foundation, just as any seminarian and priest in the church would. But the 20th century brought up a new experience of humanity that required a new response. And so phenomenology was the emergence of the same culture, the same zeitgeist that was the sexual revolution, that was a response to a lot of the wrong sort of ideas of patriarchy from the past. And there was a new appreciation for being human, the experience of being human. and a new development of this philosophy of experience that came through phenomenology. The brilliance of John Paul II is that he didn't go against Thomas. He said, let's stick with Thomas and answer the modern objections. Let's bring phenomenology, let's bring Thomism to the 20th century by appreciating phenomenology. Let's bring these things together. And so that's where we would see a deepening of an analysis of things that are very human and normal for us, like consciousness, experience, and where we would say, well, we're past the point where we can understand every experience of the human person as intentional. Not everything can be an object. So we're not just looking at the faculties of the will and the intellect as an object of intellect. We have to also say, what is it to feel and experience having an intellect? Are we able to compartmentalize that and write it down in a paragraph? The ultimate, deepest human experience cannot be summarized in a paragraph because we are unrepeatable and incommunicable. And so we want to have language that gives reverence to the incommunicability of the person. How do you do that? And that's what phenomenology opened up a tool for. And that's what JP2 clung to and used and said, this is brilliant, let's use this. And so I don't think it's this, I think it's a false dichotomy and this false polemic between the two. And I think we can just add to and deepen a real understanding of the person by borrowing from these tools of phenomenology. That's how I see personalism.
Yeah, I'd add to that too, John Paul II, the other person who was involved in that very same enterprise was Edith Stein. They came to it from opposite ends of the spectrum. John Paul II began as a Thomist, came to phenomenology. Edith Stein studied under Edmund Husserl, and Adolf Reinach, when she became Catholic, started to investigate Thomism. But they were both about the same philosophical project. And one thing I'd say about this generally Thomistic vision and this new aspect to it is that phenomenology, 20th century to now, that's kind of like a long weekend in the whole life of the Catholic Church. There's a book of a history book out there on the shelves, and it's Christianity the first 3,000 years. It's a history of Christianity that goes back to Genesis. So when you start to bring together two distinct philosophical traditions and say, how can one enrich the other, it's going to be bumps along the way. There are many Thomists who are wary of phenomenology. One thing that I think is important to say, too, is that the phenomenology that seems to have the best kind of dialogue with Thomism is realist phenomenology, that is grounded in reality, that recognizes objective truth, and that is very consistent in that sense with the Thomistic tradition, that is about being, that is about truth, and that is about, in the moral life, recognizing there is a moral vision, there is a moral structure to the whole universe that we are in some way beholden to. There is a right, there is a wrong, there are things we should do, there are things we should not do. Dietrich von Hildebrand would look at all of that and say, well, yeah. And my investigation of experience in realist phenomenology also reveals that. So, I think we're in a sense, I guess we can look at phenomenology and Thomism as the way we can with Protestant and Catholic. In the year 1600, they were kind of over here. Everybody was invested in saying, we're different from you, and we're better than you. And what's been happening over the past 4 centuries, they're coming closer and closer together. I've had some of the best conversations I've had here have been with Adam and some of the other Protestant folks about our commonalities and about how there really is a shared vision there. And once we get done yelling at each other, then we can have that conversation.
Yeah. All right, so I've been instructed to ask you all to be more concise in your questions, and we will also try to roll through more of them up here as well. So,
awesome, thank you guys. I just had a question about different psychological dynamisms within certain stages of the spiritual life, purgative, illuminative, and unitive. I wonder if you guys had any maybe experience in that, or maybe there's literature on that as well. Also touching upon it, like a concept that I'm somewhat new to, that Fulton J. Sheen and Alice von Hildebrand articulated, dark night of the body. I was wondering if you guys might be able to talk a little bit about that.
Well, I can speak to the first question. We have a certification program where we train people how to do accompaniment, essentially, with this kind of integration. And we start off with a book by Father Benedict Rochelle called Spiritual Passages. And he does illuminate he illuminates the 3 ways. and he talks about the different psychological dynamics that are present. And a lot of it is coming out of this death anxiety, which is this underlying anxiety. And he says that at the point of the illuminative way, there's a crossover where our abandonment to God and trust becomes greater than our fear. And that's also coincidental with the movement from the purgative to the illuminative way. And that's why the world opens up, and it feels wonderful. It feels beautiful. You can hear the birds singing in a different way. You've already sort of resolved in a big way that sort of underlying reality that we all will die. And then there's lots of layers of defense mechanisms that get in our way. So each individual person is going to have a different flavor, but we're all sort of working through that same anxiety.
I had no idea we were going to be so Freudian today.
He wasn't all wrong.
All right.
Hi, I'm Michaela Costanzo. I wanted to confirm if I was understanding correctly that, especially you, Dr. Bottaro, see gratitude as kind of a bulwark against the death fear, because something I've noticed in myself is that sometimes my moments of spontaneous gratitude will then very quickly be overcome by such fears. Like the very thing that I'm grateful for, I then suddenly am overwhelmed by, but if it's so important to me and the loss of it. So I was just wondering if you could speak to some of that.
Yeah, we're continually challenged to keep placing our trust in God's providence. And that's why we are works in progress, and that's why we become who we are until we're dead. And so every new appreciation of God is forming us to be a better version of ourselves and opening us up to deeper realities, which then also bring in a whole new capacity for fear and anxiety. And that's why, even going through the illuminative way and even into the unitive way, there will always be these ebbs and flows of peace and desolation. So it is true, but at the same time, if you had God's eyes view of it, that outside perspective, you'd probably see ratcheting up, moving up the ladder one step at a time, even though subjectively, maybe it feels like you're back in the same old place. But if you really consider what are you anxious about, those kinds of things are likely actually progressing.
You mentioned before the notion of relationship in psychotherapy. There's a good solid century of research now saying that, what is it that really promotes change in psychotherapy? And it is the relationship. If I have a good relationship, with you, my client, which of those 100 therapy techniques should I be using? Doesn't really matter a whole lot. It's going to work. If there's no connect, if there's no chemistry, if you don't trust me, no matter what I do, it's not going to work. Therapy that's a relationship of love in a properly understood sense, that is relational, what can become clear to the client that there is a connection between this relationship, my relationship with other people, and my relationship with God. And as I progress through one, I may also well be progressing through the other. What's our ultimate goal? Union with God in love, to be joined to. And that's reflected in marriage and friendship and other kinds of things. But if we're working on relationships in the psychotherapy relationship, then that's going to spill over into every other relationship, including, in a personalist vision, my relationship with God. Go ahead.
So my name is Natalie, and I'm wondering, what do you make of the fact that phenomenology kind of was initially an attraction by a lot of thinkers that were thinking that they might have been interested in psychology? So they all left Stern and this kind of psychological school of thought because they realized it was a baby science that couldn't figure any of the questions it wanted to ask out. And then they were like, oh, but how do we even define our terms? Well, phenomenology. Mm-hmm. So then what does that look like kind of in the development of phenomenology into personalism and how that influences your thoughts about psychology?
That was Edith Stein's journey. She started out at the university as a psychology student, and once she bit into it, she discovered there's not much here. Psychology split off from natural philosophy in the late 19th century, and part of that splitting off, it really was an adolescent splitting off from the parent, if you want some good psychoanalytic stuff there. Splitting off from the parent, what did you do to help create that splitting off? Instead of philosophy, we're going to latch on to empiricism. And we're going to use the empirical method as our one and only method. What does that mean? We embrace a materialist, determinist vision of the universe. If you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. And then psychology tries to move forward on that foundation. People like Edith Stein took their first psychology class and said, nah. The move over to philosophy and the move over to Husserl in particular was because it opened the door to embrace the whole of the person. When you talk about consciousness and conscious experience and relation and empathy, that's where the money is. That's the real nature of the human person that at that time psychology could not provide. We used to, some of my colleagues, we have a kind of joke amongst ourselves. Nobody wants to teach intro psychology as it's taught now because it's a whole semester of rat psychology, experiments and sensation and perception, and those are important topics, but they're better talked about in philosophy than they are in psychology. But it grinds you down to that very physicalist, materialist, deterministic level that gives you only a fragment of what it means to be a human person. So if you look at it in that sense as to what psychology was then and in many ways still is now, it makes perfect sense they would move from that into this new philosophical vision that embraced the whole person and gave them, it gave them a way to talk about it. What does it mean to be consciousness? What is eternal time consciousness? Time doesn't move at the same rate in here as it does on the clock up there. They're asking basic fundamental questions. What is empathy? What does it mean to have empathy with another person? How does that happen? What does social contagion mean from a philosophical perspective? Phenomenology was a place where they were finding answers to those kinds of questions about the human person in their wholeness, rather than doing experiments with rats.
I think, too, it's worth saying that we're at a place now, and my proposal for Catholic psychology is that we can come back around. And I think it was an appropriate response to that reductionistic scientific approach of what psychology was. And then it went to the philosophy, something I argue in I have a little paper, I don't know if there's any copies of the little white book back there, but and I can tell you how to get it later, but especially looking at the masculine and the feminine genius. And so Sister Prudence Allen, who borrowed from Edith Stein, in some of her papers, she says the ultimate questions are up to the realm of philosophy to answer. And I would say, I think at the time that was probably true. However, if we really believe in hylomorphism, and we really believe that the body makes visible the invisible, and that when we touch a body, we touch a person, we should see all the same truths in the body. So if we really understand Catholic psychology and the unity of the person, then let's look at the body also. And if we really want to understand, for instance, the feminine genius, let's look at a female brain. And let's say, what's different about a female brain, and how is that a foundation for what we then can understand about genius? Or a male brain, how is it the foundation of masculine genius? So I think it was right to swing out to philosophy, but I think we're at a place where we can swing back as long as we're really grounding on the eternal revealed truths of the person.
There is a discipline it's quite a few decades old now of phenomenological psychology. It has its own journal, the Journal of Phenomenological Psychology. Its methodology of investigation is phenomenological rather than empirical. So there are folks in psychology, and it's based at Duquesne, half an hour away from here, over in Pittsburgh, but it's based on phenomenological investigation of the person rather than experimental, empirical investigation. So there's been this thread kind of coming through. So of course, what do all the empirical psychologists say about it? No, we don't do that stuff. But it's been a steady tradition, and it may well continue to expand over time as people recognize that there are some things that empiricism just simply cannot conceive of, measure, touch, understand.
So we have about 10 minutes left and want to cover as many questions as possible. I think we've got...
We have an online question.
Oh, please.
Yes. How can we who are not therapists better accompany our loved ones who suffer depression, self-rejection, and hatred? What are the practical ways that we can affirm it's good that they exist based on your experience as therapists?
Sometimes one of the best things you can do is put away the words. Sometimes some of the important things that happen in therapy happen in silence. I'm convinced that when we're dealing with someone who's severely ill, someone who's severely depressed, a lot more can be accomplished by holding their hand, that by trying to explain stuff, listen to them when they talk, but simply be with, accompany. To accompany them may be and just simply be there. It can be really uncomfortable at first because you want to kind of say something and solve the problem. But what the person may need is just for you to be there with them, just to be there alongside them as they go through this.
To listen to a person and receive them in that way is the most affirming thing that validates their being and their personhood. And so that's one of the ways that it's difficult is like we want to have the right answer, we want to have the right words. Well, that's really about us. And we get in the way of actually just receiving. So a lot of the difficulty is training ourselves, learning how to let ourselves be in the back seat when we're with somebody else. Maybe they just do need a pat on the back or a hand. And maybe they do want to hear what you think, but it's like wait for them to lead and really receive from them so that you're really with them in what they need. Real empathy, essentially, or tenderness, as John Paul II calls it.
One of the turning points in Sigmund Freud's education, being a physician, neurologist, they talk a lot. You come in, you say a little bit about what's wrong, and they tell you how to fix it. But there was a therapy session Freud was doing with one of his patients, and he was talking and talking and talking. And finally, the patient said, "Dr. Freud, shut up." Shut up. One of the biographies of Freud, I said, the title of that chapter is When Freud Learned to Listen. And sometimes we make the mistake of jumping into, I'm going to do a clinical interview, I'm going to get this stuff, I'm going to get a diagnosis, and Dr. Freud, shut up.
Clearly, we like to talk a lot.
So we have a question.
Hi, I'm Daniel Stepke. So you talk about how only in Christ can we resolve or approach some of our ultimate problems, and so I wonder if what you would say to the question that can you be a Christian in a have this deep integration of the truths of the faith and still have deep mental disorders, mental struggles, psychotherapeutic struggles?
Absolutely, of course. Yeah, it's not that faith heals all the wounds. It's that the only way to heal real wounds, the deepest wounds, will be through faith. But we're still not at a place that it's common language of how to connect those dots. And so we have a lot of people. I mean, our whole brand is Catholic. We're the Catholic Psych Institute. 98% of our clients are Catholic, and most of them very frequent communicants and faithful Catholics, still suffering with all the same stuff. And so we're still working through, like, how does the integration with the psychology here, how does the integration with our body really enter into our faith? How do we bring those two things together and heal the Cartesian wound that we're all actually plagued by, even if we are Christian?
Alzheimer's disease is named after the German physician Alois Alzheimer. And around 1900, he described the first case of what has now come to be called Alzheimer's disease. And a lot of his colleagues in Frankfurt thought he was weird. They used to call him the psychiatrist with a microscope because he had this bizarre idea that every psychiatric illness had a biological basis. It's bizarre at the time. As part of the healing work we do, especially with folks who are severely depressed, severely anxious, who have, those kinds of conditions have a biological basis. And there's a lot, decades and decades of research to show how do those people get better quickest? Psychotherapy plus medications. So if someone wants to do a good job of healing, you want to pull in the technology when it's appropriate. This is not to say throw a pill at them and say go home and come back and see me in 6 months. It's to say this can be an adjunct to the relationship, to the talking. When they're integrated together, things move faster, things happen faster, and people get better faster. Depression, anxiety, especially the more serious mental illnesses, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, strong genetic components, a lot of stuff that's known to be happening in the brain right down to the cellular level and neurotransmitter production and the way it happens in the brain. The medications correct a lot of the biological stuff that's undergirding what's coming up into consciousness and life and relationship in the context of mental illness. We need to make use of every tool that's available to help people get better. I'm not a pill pusher, but if I'm in a situation talking with someone where an antidepressant medication or a bipolar medication or an anti-anxiety medication or an antipsychotic medication is going to help this person move forward, then I'm going to encourage them to think about it and not just talk.
Okay, we have two questions side by side here, so I'll let them ask in turn.
Hi, my name's Jolene. This question is for Dr. Bottaro and everyone. So I really appreciate that you brought up the topic of the feminine genius, the masculine genius. I'm wondering if throughout your work, it's a different approach that women and men have to, gratitude and developing that virtue.
Did you want to ask both questions? Okay.
I'll ask mine too.
Hi, my name's Valerie. And my question's for both of you. You mentioned there were over 101 types of therapies that are missing the mark. And I was curious if you have any specific sort of examples of what exactly the key components are missing from cognitive behavioral therapy, and if that is, philosophically sound, and, if it has an element of practicing gratitude in it.
Okay. I'll start with the first question, and I'd say the biological orientation of the female brain is very much more relational and interpersonal, and so I wouldn't say my specific contribution to the genius conversation is that actually both masculine and feminine geniuses are a set of characteristics that are to be acquired by both men and women. So that's a whole nother conversation, but we want to be sure to say that qualities that are human qualities and virtues especially are equally the goal of both men and women. So I think I like the way that you approach the question. I think you're sort of getting at this. It's like there are two different ways to the same virtue. And so we could see that a female approach based on the biology of a woman's brain is going to be looking at it more relationally, whereas a man's brain is going to be much more compartmentalized, and it's going to be a little bit abstracted and even having a sort of distance. And so there might be ways. Now, the caveat to this question is that a man, especially an adult man, should have, by that point in their life, already been formed by enough feminine genius that the way they actually act is informed by the feminine genius. So we are still carrying on a narrative of a false dichotomy because we think that men are supposed to act this way and women are supposed to act this way. But actually, the feminine genius is relationality and orientation to persons, while Christ was the most oriented to persons that there is as a human, right, in his humanity. So we have to go beyond our limitations of where we're thinking about these things right now. But if we're just looking at the biology, that's how female biology would approach a virtue versus a masculine, a male brain, and that approach. Go ahead.
Edith Stein once wrote that anyone who thinks that there are professions that a woman can't do because they're male, and I quote, is clearly delusional. Delusional.
Yeah. And this is what Prudence Allen was so great about, because she talked about fractional complementarity, and then she introduced this term integral complementarity. And what's amazing about this is Stein, Prudence Allen, they're doing the work that are typically characterized as part of the masculine genius as philosophers. And there's this other work by Carl Stern, which is really brilliant psychology, where he talks about some of these same issues. But the idea is at the end of it all that we need to be able to see that we all have the capacity for the characteristics of both.
Yes.
And that's what real human development looks like. And that's why becoming saints in marriage is a real vocation. And real quick, and I'll let you answer this one too, but to the CBT question, there's nothing inherently wrong with CBT, but the way it's practiced, in my experience, is more or less relational. And relationship has to be the foundation. If you have somebody who's relational and then they say, you know what, in this moment, I think we're going to pull out the CBT technique, it's beautiful. It can hit the mark. A lot of CBT training is attractive because it doesn't implicitly have the relationality. And so it's like, oh, this is an easy workbook. I can learn how to use this and then assign this as homework, and then I can go help people with their depression. That doesn't work.
Yeah. There's a philosophical insight within Catholicism that's also helpful here too. There's no such thing as a human being concretely. There are female human beings, there are male human beings who are equal in dignity, different, and complementary. There's a whole bunch of things to hold in our head at the same time, but they're all true. When we think about what are the proper relationships between men and women, there's complementarity. Each brings something to a relationship that is at least a stronger aspect than what the man has. The woman has some talents, men have some talents. You put them together, you get closer to that notion of a whole human being in terms of all the things that persons are able to do and think and see and understand. And I agree with what you said about cognitive behavioral therapy. It's many of the therapies, the difficulty they was, it was not that they're wrong, but that they're incomplete. They're incomplete. There's more that could be done. When I do a clinical interview for a neuropsychology evaluation, where I'm about to do cognitive testing about attention and concentration and memory and language and executive skills, one of the early questions I ask in the interview is, what's your religious background? What tradition were you brought up in? Do you practice the tradition now? Just by doing that opens doors for people to start talking about that whole aspect of themselves that if I never mentioned it, would never come up, and there'd be a gap, a piece missing in that. I'm asking it partly as a social question to say, what kind of social support do you have? But I'm also asking the question of where's the ground you stand on when you need to find meaning in suffering? But just by asking that simple question, what's your religious background, that broadens out all the techniques, all the specific things, all the specific interventions you're going to do. And I've already signaled to the person, it's okay to talk about this stuff. It's okay to bring it up. It's okay to enter it into the conversation from when this person's saying, why is this happening to me? Why am I suffering? There are answers to that available in the tradition that we can share with people and bring to people that can help them in the healing process. And not just body, not just psyche, but spirit as well.
Well, I want to thank both of you all. It's clear we could go on for a long time, but thankfully both of you are here, so I'm sure you'd be happy to speak with our audience. So thank you very much for a stimulating conversation. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you.